March 15, 1943, Tunisia, North Africa. The sand was the color of dried blood. Lieutenant David Mitchell sat in the commander's seat of his Sherman tank, eyes pressed against the periscope. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly in every direction. Heat waves shimmered off the dunes. The temperature inside the tank was 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Sweat poured down David's face, stinging his eyes, soaking through his uniform. He was 23 years old. His crew had been together for 8 months. They'd given the tank a name, Lucky Strike, painted it right on the turret in white letters. They believed in the name. They believed in luck. You had to believe in something when you climbed into a steel box that the enemy could turn into a coffin. Through the periscope, David scanned the horizon. Rocky outcroppings, scattered vegetation, the ruins of what might have been a farmhouse before the war came through and destroyed everything. Nothing moved. Then his radio crackled to life. The voice belonged to Sergeant Miller, manning the lead Sherman in their column. His words came fast, urgent, cutting through the static like a knife. Tiger, 2 o'clock, 800 yards. David's heart stopped. He swung his periscope to the right. At first he saw nothing. Then the shape resolved itself against the landscape. Low, massive, angular. The German Tiger tank sat hull down behind a sand dune, only its turret visible. But that was enough. That turret was rotating slowly, deliberately hunting for targets. The 88mm gun looked like the barrel of hell itself. David grabbed his radio transmitter. His voice came out steady despite the fear flooding through his veins. All units back up. Back up now. His driver threw the Sherman into reverse. The engine roared. Gears ground. The tank lurched backward. Too slow. Everything was too slow. David watched through the periscope as the Tiger's turret continued its rotation, smooth, unhurried, like a predator that knew its prey couldn't escape. The turret stopped moving. The gun was pointing directly at Lucky Strike. David had time for one thought, just one. His mind flashed to his older brother, Thomas, back in Pittsburgh. Tommy had always been the smart one, the one who understood math and science and how things worked. Tommy had promised him before he shipped out. They'll figure something out, Dave. The military knows what they're doing. Our shells will get better. You'll be fine. Then David saw the muzzle flash. The world exploded. The German 88mm shell crossed 800 yards in less than a second. It struck Lucky Strike's front armor like the fist of God. The Sherman's armor was 51mm thick. The German shell punched through it like paper. The projectile continued through the interior of the tank, through equipment and ammunition and flesh, before exiting out the back. Then the secondary explosion came. The ammunition stored inside Lucky Strike cooked off. Dozens of shells detonating simultaneously. The force tore the tank apart from the inside. The turrets separated from the hull. Metal screamed. Fire bloomed orange and black against the desert sky. But Lieutenant David Mitchell never felt the end. None of the 5 men inside that Sherman had time to scream. 800 yards away, the German Tiger tank sat undamaged. Its crew was already traversing the turret toward the next target. In 10 minutes, they would destroy 3 more American tanks. The crews inside those tanks had names and families and dreams and futures. The Tiger didn't care. Its armor was too thick. Its gun was too powerful. And American shells couldn't touch it. This was March 15, 1943. The telegram arrived in Pittsburgh 14 days later. Thomas Mitchell was sitting at his desk at the Bureau of Mines when his supervisor walked in. The older man's face was pale. He was holding a yellow envelope. Western Union. Everyone knew what yellow envelopes meant during wartime. Everyone dreaded seeing them. Thomas looked up from his calculations. He was working on a mining project, analyzing the best way to use shaped charges to break through particularly hard rock formations deep underground. The work was important. The mines needed copper and iron and coal for the war effort. Thomas told himself his work mattered even though he wasn't in uniform like his brother. His supervisor handed him the envelope without speaking. Thomas's hands shook as he opened it. The paper inside was thin, cheap. The message was typed in block letters. Official, impersonal, cold. The words swam before his eyes. Regret to inform you. Killed in action. March 15, 1943. North Africa. Grateful nation. Thomas read it 3 times. The words didn't change. David was dead. His little brother, the kid he'd taught to ride a bike, to throw a baseball, to ask girls to dance. Dead in the desert, 8,000 miles from home, burned alive in a metal box because American tanks couldn't fight German tanks and American shells couldn't penetrate German armor. Thomas stood up. His legs felt weak. His supervisor was saying something, offering condolences, but Thomas couldn't hear him. There was a roaring sound in his ears, like wind in a tunnel. He walked out of his office, down the hallway, out into the cold March afternoon. Pittsburgh was gray and industrial around him. Smoke from steel mills darkened the sky. The city was working overtime to feed the war machine. Tanks and shells and bombs and bullets. But none of it was good enough. None of it could save David. Thomas stood on the sidewalk and tried to breathe. His brother was dead, and Thomas had told him to trust the experts, had told him the military knew what they were doing, had told him everything would be fine. But everything was not fine. The military did not have the answers. The experts were failing. And boys like David were dying because nobody could figure out how to build a shell that could punch through German armor. Thomas looked down at the telegram still clutched in his hand. The paper crumpled in his grip. Something crystallized inside him in that moment. Something hard and sharp and unbreakable. If the experts couldn't fix this, he would. 2 weeks later, Thomas Mitchell stood in a conference room in Washington, facing men who had spent 30 years designing weapons and told them their approach was wrong. They laughed at him. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we go further into Thomas's story, before we see how one civilian engineer with no military experience would invent a weapon that changed warfare forever, I need to ask you something. Many of you watching this video had fathers or grandfathers who served in World War II. Maybe they were in the armored divisions. Maybe they climbed into Sherman tanks knowing the odds were against them. Maybe they wrote letters home trying to sound brave when they were terrified. Maybe they never talked about what they saw because the memories were too painful. If your family has a story from those days, if you remember conversations about tank warfare, if you found old letters or photographs or medals in a dusty box in the attic, share it in the comments below. These stories matter. They're not just history. They're why Thomas Mitchell did what he did. They're why he refused to give up even when everyone told him he was wasting his time. Hit that like button if you're ready to hear about an American civilian who proved the entire military establishment wrong. And subscribe to this channel because we tell the stories of everyday Americans who did extraordinary things when freedom hung in the balance. Now let's meet Thomas Mitchell. The man, the metallurgist, the brother who carried guilt like a weight on his shoulders and turned that guilt into determination that nothing could break. January 1944. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Thomas Mitchell was 34 years old. He lived with his wife Margaret in a small apartment in the Oakland neighborhood. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen barely big enough for one person to move around in, and a living room with a window that looked out at a brick wall. The rent was $45 a month. They could barely afford it. Margaret was 6 months pregnant with their first child. This should have been the happiest time of Thomas's life. A baby on the way, a steady job at the Bureau of Mines, a wife who loved him despite his obsessive work habits and tendency to stay up until 3 in the morning scribbling calculations. But David's death had changed everything. Changed Thomas. He couldn't look at Margaret's swelling belly without thinking about the telegram. Without thinking about his mother back in Philadelphia, who had received the same telegram, whose younger son would never meet his nephew or niece. Thomas owed the bank $2,300. This was a fortune in 1904. Thomas made $3,200 a year. His debt was nearly a year's salary. He had borrowed the money to buy equipment for experiments his supervisors at the Bureau hadn't authorized. Crucibles for melting metal, precision measuring tools, detonators, small quantities of explosives. Everything he needed to test his theory about shaped charges. Margaret worried constantly about money. She clipped coupons. She stretched every ration. She mended Thomas's socks and shirts instead of buying new ones. She never complained, but Thomas saw the worry lines forming around her eyes, saw her calculating in her head every time they bought groceries, figuring out how to make the money last until the next paycheck. And Thomas kept spending money they didn't have on copper and explosives and equipment because he couldn't stop thinking about David. Picture Thomas Mitchell at his kitchen table, 2 o'clock in the morning. Margaret asleep in the bedroom, their unborn child growing inside her, dreaming whatever dreams unborn children dream. The apartment was cold. The radiator in the corner clanked and hissed, but never quite produced enough heat. Thomas wore a cardigan over his shirt. His fingers were stiff from the cold as he wrote. Papers covered the table. Diagrams, calculations, angles and velocities and pressures. Thomas had drunk an entire pot of coffee. The cup beside him had gone cold an hour ago, but he kept sipping from it anyway, barely noticing the bitter taste. He was working on the physics of shape charges. Most people in 1944 had never heard of shape charges, but Thomas knew them well from his mining work. When you needed to cut through hard rock deep underground, you didn't just pack explosives into a hole and light the fuse. That wasted energy. The explosion went in all directions, most of it doing nothing useful. Instead, you shaped the explosive. You put a cone of copper at the front. When the explosive detonated, it collapsed the copper cone inwards so fast and with so much pressure that the metal turned into something like a liquid. A jet. That jet of superheated copper shot forward at impossible speeds, 25 times faster than sound, and it could cut through rock like a blowtorch through butter. Thomas had seen it work 100 times in mines. So why couldn't it work against armor? The military experts said it couldn't. They said armor was different from rock. They said a hollow shell had no mass, and without mass, you couldn't penetrate thick steel. They said Thomas was wasting his time thinking about this. They said he should stick to mining and leave weapons design to people who understood weapons. But Thomas didn't believe them. The math said it would work. The physics said it would work. And Thomas trusted math and physics more than he trusted experts who'd been doing things the same way for 30 years. Outside the kitchen window, Pittsburgh slept. The steel mills never stopped, though. Even at 2 in the morning, Thomas could see the glows of furnaces reflected off low clouds. Smoke and fire. The city churning out metal for the war machine. Tanks and guns and shells. But the shells didn't work. The tanks burned. The boys died. Thomas set down his pencil, rubbed his eyes, picked up David's last letter for the 100th time. His brother had written it 3 weeks before he died. The paper was creased from being folded and unfolded so many times. David's handwriting was neat, careful. Their mother had taught both boys to write properly. She'd been a school teacher before she married. The letter was mostly cheerful. David talked about the desert, about scorpions in his boots, about the terrible coffee they served in the mess tent. He joked about the heat, about sand getting into everything, about how he'd never complain about Pittsburgh winters again. But near the end, David's tone changed. He wrote, "Tommy, I need to tell you something. Our shells don't work against the German tanks. I watch them bounce off the armor. Just bounce off like throwing rocks at a bank vault. And the German guns tear through us like paper. We lost 2 Shermans last week. 10 men. Good men. I knew them, Tommy. We played cards together the night before. The brass say they're working on it, say we'll get better ammunition soon. But I don't know. I don't think they know how to fix it. The Tiger tanks are too good. We can't fight them straight up. We have to flank them, try to hit the sides or rear. But that means getting close. And getting close means half of us don't make it. I'm not trying to scare you. I just wanted you to know. In case something happens. In case I don't make it home. Trust the experts, Dave." Thomas had written back. "The military knows what they're doing. Our scientists are the best in the world. They'll figure it out. You'll be fine." 2 weeks later, David was dead. Thomas folded the letter carefully, put it back in the envelope, looked at the calculations spread across his kitchen table. The experts were wrong. The military didn't know what it was doing. The scientists hadn't figured it out. Boys were dying by the hundreds, by the thousands. And Thomas Mitchell, who'd never fired a gun in his life, who studied rocks instead of weapons, who everyone said should mind his own business, was going to fix it. He picked up his pencil again, started calculating the exact angle the copper cone needed to be. 42 degrees, that was the magic number. Too steep and the metal wouldn't collapse properly. Too shallow and the jet wouldn't form. But at exactly 42 degrees, with the right thickness of copper and the right explosive behind it, the physics said it would work. The physics said a hollow shell could defeat armor that solid shells couldn't touch. The physics said one man with borrowed equipment and scrap metal could save thousands of lives. The physics said Thomas Mitchell could make David's death mean something. Morning came slowly. Gray light filtered through the kitchen window. Margaret appeared in the doorway wearing her robe, her hand resting on her swollen belly. She looked at Thomas still in his clothes from yesterday, surrounded by papers, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. She didn't say anything, just walked to the stove and started making breakfast. Scrambled eggs using their weekly ration. Toast from bread she'd baked herself because bakery bread cost too much. The last strips of bacon they'd been saving. Thomas watched her move around the tiny kitchen, watched her cook breakfast for a husband who was driving them into debt, chasing an idea everyone said was stupid, who stayed up all night scribbling equations instead of coming to bed, who was obsessed with avenging a brother who couldn't be brought back. She set a plate in front of him, sat down across the table, put her hand on his. Her voice was gentle but firm. "Tom, you have to let this go." Thomas looked at her. At this woman who'd married him 5 years ago when he was just a junior engineer with big dreams and no money, who'd stood by him through every crazy project and late-night obsession, who was carrying his child and worrying about money and dealing with a husband who couldn't let go of his brother's death. "I can't, Maggie. I can't let it go. We owe the bank $2,300. The baby's coming in June. You could lose your job if they find out you're using bureau equipment without authorization." "I know. Then why are you doing this? Why are you risking everything?" Thomas pushed his untouched breakfast away, pulled David's letter from his pocket, laid it on the table between them. "Because I told him to trust the experts. I told him the military knew what it was doing. I promised him he'd be fine. And he believed me, Maggie. He trusted me. And now he's dead." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She'd loved David too. He'd been at their wedding barely 17, awkward, in a borrowed suit, dancing with all the bridesmaids and making them laugh with his terrible jokes. "Tom, David's death wasn't your fault." Thomas's voice broke. "But I can save the others. Don't you see every day I don't act more boys like David climb into tanks they can't protect? More mothers get telegrams. More wives become widows. I can fix this, Maggie. The math works. I know it works. I just have to prove it." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the city was waking up. Factory whistles, traffic, the sounds of a nation at war. Finally, she spoke. "How long?" How long until you can prove it?" Thomas thought about everything he needed to do. Build the shells, test them, find someone who would actually listen, convince the military to try something new. 3 months, maybe 4. By June at the latest. The baby's due in June, I know. I'll be done by then, I promise. Margaret studied his face, saw the determination there, the guilt, the desperate need to make his brother's death mean something. She knew that look. Once Thomas set his mind to something, nothing could stop him. Not poverty, not exhaustion, not common sense. She squeezed his hand. "Okay, but Tom, if you're going to do this, really do it. Don't just tinker in the lab. Make it work. Prove everyone wrong. Save those boys. Give David's death meaning. Because if you fail, if you waste our money and risk your job and drive us into poverty for nothing, I will never forgive you, and neither will you." Thomas nodded, swallowed hard, picked up his fork and started eating the cold eggs. This is what separated Thomas Mitchell from the experts in Washington who'd spent decades designing weapons. They had credentials and experience and authority. Thomas had something else, something deeper, something more powerful. He had the American belief that one person could make a difference, that when the system failed, you didn't accept failure. You fixed it. That when authorities said impossible, sometimes they were just protecting their own egos. That when your brother died in a burning tank because nobody could solve the problem, you solved it yourself. This was January 1944, 3 months before Thomas would stand in a conference room full of colonels and generals and tell them their 30 years of experience was worthless. 5 months before D-Day, when thousands of young men would storm French beaches while Thomas's shells rode in the tanks behind them. But first, Thomas had to build those shells. He had to prove the impossible. He had to become the man who changed warfare forever. And he had to do it with borrowed equipment, scrap copper, and the memory of his dead brother, driving him forward through every obstacle, every setback, every expert who told him he was wasting his time. The story of Thomas Mitchell is the story of stubborn American determination, of refusal to accept no for an answer, of one civilian who trusted physics more than authority and math more than tradition. It's the story of how David Mitchell's death was not meaningless, how his older brother made sure of that, how guilt and love and rage became focus, became action, became shells that could destroy Tiger tanks with a single shot. In the next part of this story, we'll see Thomas walk into that Washington conference room. We'll watch him stand up in front of military brass who'd forgotten more about weapons than he'd ever know. We'll hear him explain shaped charges and copper cones and focused explosive energy. And we'll see Colonel Frank Garrison, 32 years of experience, designer of the shells every American tank carried, look at Thomas Mitchell like he was an idiot and say the words that would haunt him for the rest of his career. This is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. But Thomas Mitchell didn't care what Colonel Garrison thought. He didn't care about rank or credentials or decades of experience. He cared about math. He cared about physics. And he cared about making sure no other brother had to open a yellow telegram and read those terrible words. Regret to inform you, 3 months. That's all Thomas had. 3 months to turn scrap metal and borrowed equipment into a weapon that would save thousands of lives. 3 months to prove everyone wrong. 3 months to make David's death mean something. The clock was ticking, and Thomas Mitchell was just getting started. January 18th, 1944, Washington District of Columbia. The War Department building rose 8 stories above Constitution Avenue, stone and concrete, and American power made manifest. Inside, men in uniform moved through corridors with purpose and urgency. Telephones rang constantly. Typewriters clattered. Orders were given and received. The machinery of war turned without pause. Thomas Mitchell stood in the lobby holding a briefcase that contained everything he owned that mattered. Diagrams of copper cone designs. Calculations proving shaped charges could defeat armor. Photographs of mining operations where focused explosives cut through solid rock. His brother's last letter creased from being read too many times. He wore his only suit, navy blue slightly worn at the elbows. Margaret had pressed it the night before. She'd stood in their tiny apartment with the iron in her hand and asked him one more time if he was sure about this. If he really wanted to risk everything on a single presentation to military men who probably wouldn't listen. Thomas had kissed her forehead, felt their baby kick against his hand through her dress, told her he had no choice. Now he was here. A secretary led him down a corridor to a conference room. The door was heavy oak. Through the frosted glass window, Thomas could see shapes moving. Men talking. The meeting had already started. The secretary knocked once, opened the door without waiting for a response. The conference room was larger than Thomas's entire apartment. A massive table dominated the center, polished mahogany that reflected the overhead lights. 20 men sat around that table. Officers, mostly their uniforms decorated with ribbons and insignia Thomas didn't fully understand. A few civilians in expensive suits. Everyone looked important. Everyone looked busy. Everyone looked like they had better things to do than listen to a mining engineer from Pittsburgh. At the head of the table sat General Harold Morrison, 58 years old, gray hair cut military short, 3 stars on his collar. He was running the meeting with the efficiency of a man who'd spent his entire adult life giving orders and having them obeyed without question. Morrison glanced up as Thomas entered. "Dr. Mitchell, you're late. Find a seat in the back." "We'll get to you when we get to you." Thomas sat in a folding chair against the wall, not at the table, not part of the inner circle. An observer, a minor functionary from a minor bureau who'd been allowed to attend as a courtesy and nothing more. On the wall behind General Morrison hung a map of Europe. Red pins marked German positions. Blue pins marked Allied forces. The density of red pins in France was sobering. The Germans had been fortifying the coast for years. Everyone in this room knew the invasion was coming. The only questions were when and where, and whether it would succeed. Morrison was speaking about the Tiger tank problem. His voice was measured professional, but Thomas could hear the frustration underneath. This was a man who'd been trying to solve an impossible problem for 2 years and was running out of time. "Gentlemen, the numbers are unacceptable. When our Sherman tanks encounter German Tigers in combat, we lose 75% of the time. Our crews have a 23% survival rate. That's not warfare, that's slaughter." Morrison gestured to another officer who stood and approached a blackboard at the front of the room. The officer began writing specifications. Tiger tank front armor 100 millimeters thick, angled at 60 degrees. Effective thickness 180 millimeters. Sherman 75 millimeter gun maximum penetration at 500 yards 80 millimeters. The math was brutal. American guns couldn't penetrate German armor at any range where tank battles actually happened. To get close enough for a kill shot meant getting close enough to die first. And the Tiger never missed. Morrison continued, Normandy is coming. The exact date is classified, but you all know it's soon. We're going to put thousands of men on those beaches. We're going to push tanks into France. And if we can't solve this problem, those tanks will be destroyed. Those men will die, and the invasion will fail. He paused. Let the weight of those words settle over the room. I've called this meeting to hear solutions. Real solutions. Not theories or maybes, or we're working on it. I need weapons that can kill tigers before tigers kill us. Anyone. The room erupted into discussion. A colonel from the Ordnance Corps proposed increasing shell velocity with improved propellants. Morrison asked how much improvement. 12%, the colonel said. Morrison pointed out that 12% wasn't enough to penetrate Tiger armor. The colonel sat down. A British liaison suggested adopting their 17-pounder gun. Bigger, more powerful. Morrison asked about logistics. How long to retrofit American tanks? How much did the guns weigh? Could existing supply chains support the ammunition? The British officer admitted it would take 6 months minimum, and the guns were so heavy they'd require entirely new tank designs. 6 months was too long. A civilian from a defense contractor proposed tungsten core shells. Tungsten was harder than steel, could punch through armor. Conventional shells couldn't touch. Morrison asked how much tungsten was available. Not enough, the civilian admitted. Tungsten was rare. There wasn't enough in the entire United States to supply the Army for more than a few weeks. The discussion went in circles. Every proposal had fatal flaws. Too expensive, too slow, required resources that didn't exist. The men in this room were the best minds American military had to offer, and they were failing. Thomas sat in his folding chair and listened and felt anger building in his chest. These men were talking about the Tiger problem like it was an engineering challenge, a puzzle to solve, an inconvenience to manage. They used words like acceptable losses and statistical analysis and strategic considerations. They weren't talking about David. They weren't talking about 20-year-old boys burning alive in metal coffins because nobody could figure out how to build a shell that worked. Thomas raised his hand. Nobody noticed. The discussion continued, voices talking over each other, frustration mounting, time running out. Thomas stood up. Morrison glanced in his direction. Irritation flashed across the general's face. Dr. Mitchell, we'll get to mining concerns later. Please sit down. This isn't about mining, sir. I have a solution to the Tiger problem. The room went quiet. 20 faces turned toward Thomas. Some looked curious. Most looked annoyed. A mining engineer. A civilian. Interrupting a military planning session to offer solutions to problems he didn't understand. Morrison's voice was tight. You have 2 minutes, Dr. Mitchell. Make them count. Thomas opened his briefcase, pulled out his diagrams, walked to the front of the room on legs that felt like they might give out, spread the papers on the table in front of men who had decades more experience than he did. His mouth was dry. His heart hammered against his ribs. But his voice when he spoke was steady. The problem isn't velocity or shell weight or gun size. The problem is approach. We're trying to defeat armor with kinetic energy, mass times velocity. Hit it hard enough and fast enough, and eventually it breaks. But Tiger armor is too thick. We can't hit it hard enough, not with guns small enough to mount on a Sherman. Morrison leaned forward slightly, interested despite himself. What are you proposing? Thomas pointed to his diagram of a shaped charge. The copper cone. The explosive behind it. The physics of focused energy. Instead of hitting the armor, we cut through it. Shaped charges. A hollow shell with a copper cone inside. When the explosive detonates, it collapses the cone so fast the copper turns into a jet. That jet travels at 8,000 meters per second, 25 times the speed of sound. Temperature hot enough to melt steel. And it focuses all the explosive energy into a point the size of a pencil. He pulled out photographs from his mining work. Rock faces with perfect circular holes cut through them. Shaped charges used to create ventilation shafts in hard granite. I've seen this work hundreds of times in mines. The physics is proven. A focused explosive jet can cut through material that blunt force can't touch. And armor is just hard material. If it works on rock, it'll work on steel. Thomas looked around the room, saw skepticism on every face except one, a colonel sitting halfway down the table. The man's nameplate read Garrison, Colonel Frank Garrison. Garrison was 56 years old. His uniform was immaculate. His posture was perfect. His face showed the confidence of someone who had spent 32 years designing artillery and knew everything there was to know about making shells that killed people. He stood up slowly. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of authority. Dr. Mitchell, I've been designing munitions since before you were born. I created the M61 armor-piercing round currently used in every American tank. I've forgotten more about ballistics than you'll ever learn. Garrison walked to the blackboard, picked up a piece of chalk, started writing equations. What you're proposing is a hollow shell, no mass. Basic physics tells us that penetration requires mass. Kinetic energy equals 1/2 mass times velocity squared. Your hollow shell has no mass. Therefore, it has no penetration capability. It will bounce off armor like a tennis ball. He turned to face Thomas. The look in his eyes was pure condescension. This is munitions 101, Dr. Mitchell. This is fundamental physics. And what you're suggesting violates every principle of ballistics that's been proven over decades of research and battlefield experience. Garrison looked at Morrison. Sir, I recommend we move on to serious proposals. Dr. Mitchell means well, I'm sure, but this is frankly the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Several officers around the table nodded in agreement. One actually laughed. A British major named Edmund Burke spoke up from the far end of the table. Colonel Garrison is quite right. A hollow shell defeating armor. That's fantasy. Might as well propose throwing empty tin cans at the Tigers and hoping they surrender from embarrassment. More laughter. Thomas felt heat rising in his face. Not embarrassment, anger. These men who'd spent decades designing weapons that didn't work were laughing at him. These experts who'd failed to solve the Tiger problem were dismissing him without even considering the evidence. He tried to explain, tried to describe how shaped charges work differently from kinetic penetrators, how the mechanism wasn't mass but focused energy, how the copper jet formed in microseconds and cut rather than punched. Garrison cut him off. Enough. General Morrison, this is a waste of time. I've seen these mining toys Dr. Mitchell is talking about. They're for breaking rock, not defeating military armor. The temperatures and pressures are completely different. The materials are different. The physics doesn't translate. Morrison looked at Thomas. The general's face showed something that might have been pity. Dr. Mitchell, thank you for your input, but I think we need to focus on practical solutions from people with relevant experience. You're dismissed. Thomas gathered his papers. His hands were shaking. Every eye in the room was on him as he walked back to his chair, picked up his briefcase, and left. The heavy oak door closed behind him with a sound like a coffin lid. In the hallway outside, Thomas leaned against the wall, breathed deeply, tried to control the rage and humiliation surging through him. Stupidest thing I've ever heard. Those words echoed in his skull. Garrison's mocking tone, Burke's laughter, Morrison's dismissal. These men were going to let boys die because they were too arrogant to listen. Let's pause Thomas's story for a moment, because what happened in that conference room wasn't really about shaped charges or copper cones or physics. It was about something deeper, something more fundamental to how power works. The men in that room had credentials. They had decades of experience. They had positions of authority. They'd spent their entire careers inside a system that rewarded conformity and punished deviation. They knew the right way to do things because they'd been doing things that way for 30 years. And here came Thomas Mitchell, civilian, mining engineer, no military experience, no weapons background, telling them they were wrong. Of course they dismissed him. But here's what those experts didn't understand. Here's what they'd forgotten somewhere along the way. Innovation doesn't come from inside the system. It comes from outside, from people who don't know the rules and therefore don't know what's impossible. The Wright brothers weren't aviation experts. Henry Ford wasn't a manufacturing expert. The scientists who built the atomic bomb weren't traditional weapons designers. They were outsiders who looked at old problems with new eyes and asked one simple question. What if the experts are wrong? Thomas Mitchell was asking that question, and he was about to prove the answer. That night, Thomas took the train back to Pittsburgh. 12 hours sitting in coach while America rolled past the windows. Farmland and forests and small towns doing their part for the war. Factories running night shifts. Victory gardens. Rationing. Sacrifice. The train smelled like cigarette smoke and unwashed bodies and the cheap coffee they sold from a cart in the dining car. Someone 3 rows back was playing a harmonica. Sentimental Journey. That song was everywhere in 1944. Every radio station, every jukebox. The soundtrack of a nation at war. Thomas couldn't sleep, couldn't read, couldn't do anything but stare out the window at darkness and replay the meeting in his head. Stupidest thing I've ever heard. Margaret had packed him sandwiches for the trip. Ham and cheese on white bread, an apple, cookies made with their sugar ration. Thomas ate mechanically, tasting nothing. His mind was elsewhere. By the time the train pulled into Pittsburgh at 6 in the morning, Thomas had made a decision. He wouldn't ask permission anymore. He wouldn't try to convince experts who'd made up their minds. He would build the shells himself, test them in secret, prove they worked with evidence so clear that even Garrison couldn't dismiss it. Margaret was awake when Thomas walked into their apartment. She was making breakfast. Scrambled eggs toast the last of their bacon ration. She took one look at his face and knew. They said no. Thomas set down his briefcase, sat heavily at the kitchen table. The same table where he'd spent so many nights calculating and planning and believing he could make a difference. They said it was stupid. They laughed Maggie. Margaret poured coffee, strong and black, sat down across from him. So what are you going to do? Thomas looked at his wife. At this woman who believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself, who was carrying their child and worrying about money and dealing with a husband obsessed with avenging a dead brother. I'm going to build it anyway. Margaret didn't look surprised. Tom, we can't afford this. The baby's coming in 5 months. We already owe the bank $2,300. If you lose your job because you're using bureau equipment without authorization, we'll lose everything. I know. Then why? Because every day I don't act more boys like David die. Because the experts are wrong and I can prove it. Because if I don't do this, if I just accept their no and go back to my regular job and let this go, I'll never forgive myself. And David's death will be meaningless. Margaret was quiet for a long time. Outside their window, Pittsburgh was waking up. Factory whistles, morning traffic, another day of war production. Finally, she spoke. How long? What? How long until you can prove it? 3 months, maybe less. I can build the shells at night. Test them somewhere abandoned. Show results that nobody can argue with. And if you are caught, then I'm fired. Maybe arrested for theft of government property. Maybe we lose everything. Margaret's hand moved to her belly, their child growing larger every day. Due in June, the same month as D-Day, though neither of them knew that yet. Okay, Thomas looked up, surprised. Okay, do it. Build your shells. Prove everyone wrong. Save those boys. Give David's death meaning. She leaned forward. Her voice was fierce. But Tom, if you're going to do this, really do it. Don't half-ass it. Don't tinker around the edges. Commit. Risk everything. Because if you fail, if you waste our money and jeopardize our future for nothing, it'll destroy you. And I won't be able to put you back together. Thomas reached across the table, took her hand. I won't fail. You better not. This was the moment that separated Thomas Mitchell from every other person who had a good idea and let it die. This was the moment he stopped asking permission and started taking action. This was when the mining engineer became the weapons designer who would change warfare forever. But first he needed copper. February 1944. The hunt for materials began. Copper was rationed for the war effort. Every ounce was tracked. Every sheet in wire and pipe had to be accounted for. Thomas couldn't just order what he needed through official channels. That would require explaining why he wanted it. And explaining would mean revealing his unauthorized project. So Thomas went scrounging. He visited every scrapyard in Pittsburgh, told them he was doing mining research, which was technically true, just not the whole truth. At a yard in the Strip District, an old Italian immigrant named Giuseppe ran the operation. Giuseppe's son was fighting in Italy, fighting Mussolini, fighting the same war David had died in. Giuseppe listened to Thomas's story, looked at the young engineer with his desperate eyes and worn suit, walked to the back of the yard and returned carrying bent copper pipes salvaged from a demolished building. "You use this for something good, yes. Something that helps end the war," Thomas promised he would. Giuseppe wouldn't take payment, just shook Thomas's hand and said, "God bless America," and walked away wiping his eyes. Thomas collected copper wherever he could find it. Damaged electrical wire, sheets too bent for construction use, pipes with cracks that made them unusable for plumbing. He piled it all in the trunk of his 1937 Ford and drove home feeling like a thief even though everything was freely given. Late at night after his regular work shift ended, Thomas would return to the Bureau of Mines laboratory. The building was supposed to be locked after 6 p.m., but Thomas had made friends with the night security guard, a man named Walter who'd served in the First World War and understood what it meant to want to help boys at the front. Walter would unlock the door. Thomas would slip inside, and for the next 6 or 8 hours, Thomas would work. He melted copper in furnaces designed for analyzing or samples. The metal glowed orange, then yellow, then white. The heat was intense even from 6 feet away. Thomas's face would burn, sweat would pour down his back, the smell of hot metal and sulfur would get into his clothes, his hair, his skin. Margaret joked that she could smell him coming from down the block. The first copper cone Thomas made was a disaster. He'd hammered the sheet into roughly the right shape, used calipers to measure the thickness, found that one side was 0.9 millimeters while another was 0.7, 0.2 of a millimeter difference. Barely noticeable to the eye, but that 0.2 would make the explosive jet spray sideways instead of straight. The cone was useless. Thomas threw it away and started over, and failed again, and again. The first 20 cones he made were all wrong. Uneven thickness, wrong angles, cracks from improper annealing, warping from uneven cooling. Everyone was garbage. But Thomas kept going. He adjusted his technique, learned to heat the copper to exactly the right temperature. Not so hot, it became brittle. Not so cool, it wouldn't form properly. He carved wooden forms to help shape the metal consistently. He measured obsessively with calipers accurate to 1/100th of a millimeter. By the middle of February, he was producing cones that met his specifications. 42-degree angle, 0.8 millimeter thickness throughout. No variations, no cracks. Perfect. The explosive was even trickier. Thomas borrowed small quantities of RDX from Bureau mining stocks, just a little at a time. Never enough that anyone would notice. He'd replace it slowly over weeks, so the inventory always balanced. He measured detonation velocities with equipment meant for testing mining explosives. The burn rate had to be exactly 8,000 meters per second. Too fast and the explosive would shatter the copper before the jet could form. Too slow and the cone wouldn't collapse properly. The jet would be weak, ineffective. Thomas tested dozens of mixtures, different ratios of RDX to binding agents, different detonator configurations, different standoff distances between the explosive and the cone. His notebook filled with results, temperatures, pressures, velocities, success and failure recorded in neat columns of numbers. Margaret would wake at 2 in the morning and find his side of the bed empty. She'd put on her robe, walk to the kitchen, find Thomas hunched over his notebook by lamplight, calculating. Always calculating. Sometimes she'd make him coffee. Sometimes she'd just kiss the top of his head and go back to bed. She was 7 months pregnant now, moving slower, tired all the time, worried about money and the baby and whether her husband was going to end up in prison for theft. But she never asked him to stop. By late February, Thomas had 10 shells ready, 10 copper cone warheads assembled by hand. Each one represented weeks of work. Each one was perfect according to his calculations. Now he needed to test them, but he had no authorization, no official support. If he asked permission, Garrison would say no. Morrison would say no. Everyone would say no because the experts had already decided Thomas was wrong. So once again, Thomas decided not to ask. There was an abandoned steel mill on the outskirts of Pittsburgh. Thomas had scouted it weeks earlier, far from residential areas. Thick walls to contain blast noise. Nobody around to ask uncomfortable questions. He'd also acquired a 4-inch steel plate from a friend at Pittsburgh Steelworks. Same thickness as Tiger tank side armor. His friend hadn't asked what Thomas needed it for. Just handed over the steel and said good luck. Sunday morning, February 27th. Cold and gray, snow threatening but not yet falling. Thomas loaded his shells into the Ford's trunk. Careful, so careful. Explosives nestled in blankets Margaret had used to pack their wedding china when they moved to Pittsburgh 5 years ago. He drove slowly through empty streets, praying he wouldn't hit a pothole, praying a police officer wouldn't pull him over and ask what was in the trunk, praying he wouldn't blow himself to pieces before he could prove Garrison wrong. At the abandoned mill, Thomas set everything up with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The steel plate propped on concrete blocks. His homemade firing tube welded together from pipe sections aimed at the plate from 10 feet away. One shell loaded, detonator wired. 30-second fuse. Thomas struck a match, watched it flare, touched flame to fuse. The fuse caught, began to burn, sparks and smoke. Thomas ran, behind the concrete barrier, hands over ears, eyes squeezed shut, counting down in his head. 29, 28, 27. He thought about David, about that telegram, about Margaret waiting at home with their baby growing inside her, about Colonel Garrison's mocking voice, about all the experts who said this couldn't work. 10, 9, 8. What if they were right? What if his math was wrong? What if this whole crusade was just grief and guilt and denial? 2, 1. The world exploded. The sound was different from regular explosives, sharper, higher pitched, like cracking thunder instead of rolling thunder. Thomas's ears rang despite his hands clamped over them. Smoke filled the mill, the smell of burnt explosive and superheated metal. Thomas stayed behind the barrier, coughing, waiting, almost too scared to look. When the smoke finally cleared, he walked slowly toward the steel plate, and there it was, a perfect hole, 3 inches across, edges twisted inward, metal melted and dripping, still hot enough that Thomas could feel the heat from a foot away. He stuck his finger through the hole, through 4 inches of steel that should have been impossible to penetrate with a shell this size. Thomas Mitchell, 34-year-old metallurgist, who'd been laughed at by experts, sat down in the dirt and mud of that abandoned mill. And he wept, not from sadness, from relief, from vindication, from the knowledge that David hadn't died for nothing, that maybe, just maybe, this would save the others. But as Thomas drove home that Sunday afternoon with evidence of success carefully packed in his trunk, he faced a new problem. He'd proven his concept worked. Now he needed someone with authority to see it, someone who would actually listen, someone who wouldn't laugh, and he had 4 months until D-Day. 4 months to find that person, to convince them, to get his shells into production, to save thousands of lives. The clock was ticking, and Thomas Mitchell was running out of time. Thomas Mitchell needed an ally. He had proof now, photographic evidence of a perfect hole punched through 4 inches of steel. Evidence that shaped charges worked, that his impossible idea could actually save lives. But proof without power was meaningless. He needed someone with authority, someone who could bypass Colonel Garrison and the bureaucrats who'd dismissed him, someone who would actually listen. On March 2nd, 1944, Thomas heard about Colonel Warren Hayes. The name came up in a conversation at the Bureau of Mines. One of Thomas's colleagues mentioned reading about Hayes in a military journal, a tank commander from the First World War, currently running training operations at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and reportedly, unusually for a career military officer, Hayes actually listened to new ideas. They called him the Colonel Who Listens. Thomas made a decision that night. He would drive to Fort Knox, show up unannounced, demonstrate his shell to Hayes personally. It was crazy. It was risky. It might get him arrested. But Thomas was past caring about risks. March 3rd, Thomas left Pittsburgh at midnight. 6 hours of driving through dark Kentucky backroads. Margaret had tried to stop him. "You can't just show up at a military base with explosives in your trunk," she'd said. But Thomas had no choice. Time was running out. Fort Knox sat on 110,000 acres of Kentucky land, training grounds, barracks, the armored force school where tank crews learned to fight, and somewhere on that base, Colonel Warren Hayes. At the main gate, a young MP stopped Thomas's car. The guard looked at this civilian in a worn suit showing up at dawn without an appointment and reached for his rifle. "Sir, you need to turn around." Thomas took a breath, committed to the insanity of what he was about to say. Tell Colonel Hayes I can destroy a Tiger tank with one shot. The MP stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the vehicle. Please, just tell him. 5 minutes. That's all I need. The guard's hand was definitely on his rifle now. This situation was seconds away from going very wrong. But something in Thomas's eyes, some desperate sincerity, made the MP hesitate. Wait here, don't move. Don't touch anything. 20 minutes passed. Thomas sat in his car watching the sun rise over Kentucky, wondering if he'd just destroyed his last chance, wondering if military police were about to arrest him for trespassing and theft of government property. Then the gate opened. Colonel Warren Hayes walked out. He was 47 years old, tall and lean. A scar ran across his left cheek. Legacy of German shrapnel at Belleau Wood in 1918. His eyes were gray and cold and had seen too much death. This was a man who understood what war cost, who'd watched boys die, who carried names and faces he could never forget. Hayes stopped 3 feet from Thomas's car. His voice was flat, emotionless. Dr. Mitchell, you have 5 minutes to explain why I shouldn't have you arrested. Make them count. Thomas got out of the car, opened his briefcase, showed Hayes the photographs, the calculations, the diagram of the shaped charge design, and most importantly, the picture of that perfect hole through steel. Hayes studied the images without speaking. His face showed nothing. No interest, no skepticism, just cold evaluation. Finally, he looked up. Can you do it again? Here today. Yes, sir. Hayes glanced at his watch. Fort Knox Proving Ground. 2 hours. If this is real, you'll demonstrate. If you're wasting my time, you'll be in a military prison by sunset. Clear crystal, clear, sir. 2 hours later, Thomas stood on an artillery range with a knot in his stomach that felt like it might kill him. Hayes had provided everything. Captured Tiger tank armor from the Tunisia campaign, official test range with observation posts, 3 captain witnesses. Even a high-speed camera, rare and expensive to document whatever happened. The stakes were suffocating. If this test failed, Thomas was done. Arrested, disgraced, his family ruined, and more boys would die in tanks because nobody could defeat the Tigers. Hayes had insisted on a comparison test, scientific method, control versus experimental. First, a standard M61 armor-piercing shell. Garrison's design, the ammunition currently loaded in every American tank fighting in Europe. The gun roared. The shell struck Tiger's side armor from 100 yards. When smoke cleared, everyone walked forward to examine the result. A deep dent, maybe 2 inches. The steel was compressed. Damaged, but not penetrated. The Tiger would have survived, would have rotated its turret and killed the Sherman that fired at it. Hayes turned to Thomas. Your turn. Thomas loaded his shell personally, copper cone gleaming in Kentucky sunlight. His hands were steady now. He'd practiced this moment 100 times in his mind. Every movement deliberate, every connection checked twice. The shell seated properly, the breech closed. Thomas stepped back. Fire. The shaped charge made a different sound, sharper, like ice cracking on a frozen lake. The smoke was thinner, dissipated faster. Hayes approached the armor plate first, stopped, reached out slowly, stuck his finger through a hole the size of a baseball. The edges were melted, twisted inward. The metal had been cut, not punched. The armor hadn't stood a chance. Hayes turned to his captains. Photograph this, document everything. Then get me a secure line to General Patton. He looked at Thomas. Something that might have been respect flickered in those gray eyes. Dr. Mitchell, how many of these can you manufacture? Thomas swallowed. His voice came out rough. With proper resources, 50,000 per month by July. You'll have every resource you need. I'm making a call tonight that it's going to make some people very angry. But I don't care. This works. This saves lives. And I'm not going to let bureaucrats stop it. Hayes paused. My son is training tank crews for Normandy. Captain Robert Hayes. He's 24 years old. When he ships out, I want him carrying your shells. Understood. Yes, sir. Understood. That night, Colonel Hayes called General George Patton. Patton loved the shaped charge concept immediately. Called it beautiful. Called it warfare as art. Ordered 10,000 shells for the Normandy invasion. But orders had to go through official channels. Through the Ordnance Corps. Through Aberdeen Proving Ground. Through Colonel Frank Garrison. Garrison couldn't refuse Patton's order directly. That would be insubordination, career suicide. But he could slow the process down, bury it in bureaucracy, demand excessive testing, create obstacles. On March 10th, Thomas received official authorization to begin testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. Hayes called with the news, sounded both pleased and worried. "Tom, you've got approval, but Garrison is going to oversee everything personally. He'll make this as difficult as possible. Every test will be designed to make you fail." "I know. Can you pass? I have to. You've got 8 weeks. That leaves 4 weeks for production and shipping before Normandy. The margins are thin. Then I better not waste time." Thomas relocated to Aberdeen in mid-March. Margaret stayed in Pittsburgh. She was 8 months pregnant now. Too far along to travel, too worried about money and the future to sleep properly. But she kissed Thomas goodbye and she told him to save those boys. "Make David's sacrifice mean something," she said. Aberdeen Proving Ground was massive. 72,000 acres, hundreds of engineers, dozens of active weapons projects, and running it all Colonel Frank Garrison. Garrison assigned Thomas to a corner workshop in Building 3. Small, poorly lit. Roof leaked when it rained. The message was clear. You are not welcome here. But Thomas didn't care about comfort. He set up his equipment, crucibles for melting copper, precision tools, detonators and scales and calipers, everything needed to produce perfect shells. Within hours, the sabotage began. The copper Thomas had requisitioned got lost in shipping. The explosives he'd been promised were pending safety approval. The machine shop time he needed was fully booked for 3 weeks. Every obstacle bureaucracy could create, Garrison created. Then came the specifications warfare. Standard munitions used 99.5% pure copper. Garrison demanded 99.9%, unnecessary for the application. But it required special sourcing. Delayed everything. When Thomas questioned it, Garrison looked at him with cold satisfaction. "If we're putting experimental shells in American tanks, Dr. Mitchell, we'll use the highest quality materials. Unless you think our soldiers deserve less." The 99.9% pure copper cost $1,800. Had to be sourced from a specialty supplier in Pennsylvania. Thomas's personal debt climbed to $4,100. Margaret's letters grew increasingly worried. The bank was asking questions. Bills were piling up. And all the shells Thomas had pre-made with 99.5% copper were rejected. Weeks of work thrown away. He had to start over. Deadline until Normandy, 11 weeks. Temperature testing came next. Standard ammunition was tested from -20 to 120 Fahrenheit. Garrison insisted on -40 to 140. At -38 degrees, 2 shells failed. The copper became brittle, cracked during detonation. The jet didn't form properly. Garrison immediately called a review board. "Gentlemen, we're seeing fundamental instability. I recommend suspending this project until Dr. Mitchell can redesign from the ground up." That would take conservatively 6 months. 6 months meant no Normandy. 6 months meant failure. Thomas worked 72 hours straight, discovered the problem was in the annealing process, how the copper was heat-treated after forming. He adjusted temperature curves, cooling rates, tested again at -40. Perfect detonation, perfect penetration. But he'd lost 2 more weeks, 9 weeks until Normandy. Then came the fire. April 10th, 2:30 in the morning. Thomas was asleep on a cot in his workshop. He worked 18-hour days now, barely sleeping, living on coffee and determination. The fire alarm woke him. Smoke filled Building 3. Emergency lights, sirens, men shouting. Thomas stumbled out, coughing, eyes burning. By the time the fire was extinguished, his workshop was destroyed. 50 completed shells, perfect and ready for testing, were melted ruin. Equipment damaged, papers burned, 5 weeks of work gone. Garrison appeared at the morning briefing looking sympathetic. "A terrible accident. Electrical wiring," the report says. "These old buildings, Dr. Mitchell. I'm sorry, but without shells, we can't continue testing. Perhaps it's best we postpone the entire project." "No," Thomas's voice was raw from smoke inhalation. His clothes were black with soot. His hands were blistered from trying to save what he could. "No, I'll remake them. 2 weeks." That night, Thomas returned to the burned workshop, searching through debris, looking for evidence. He found it. A glass bottle, the smell still clinging to it. Gasoline. This hadn't been an accident. Garrison had sabotaged him. But Thomas had no proof, no witnesses. Accusing a colonel of arson without evidence would destroy what little credibility he had left. Thomas called Hayes from a payphone outside the base. "Warren, I need help. I need machinists, welders, copper. I need them tomorrow." Hayes didn't ask what happened, just said they'd be there at 800 hours. For 2 weeks, Thomas and his borrowed team worked around the clock, barely sleeping, pushing past exhaustion, racing against a deadline that was crushing them. By May 1st, they had 100 shells ready. 5 weeks until Normandy. Time for the final test, the test that would determine everything. General Morrison came, Colonel Garrison, Colonel Hayes, British observers, 20 senior officers, all watching, all judging. The target was Tiger tank number 131, actually captured from Tunisia, the same type that had killed David Mitchell. Thomas stood on that range looking at the Tiger and thought, "This is what killed my brother. This is what I'm going to destroy." Garrison had chosen the hardest possible test parameters: 800 yards, realistic combat range. Target the Tiger's front glacis plate, the thickest armor, 100 millimeters at 60 degrees, effectively 180 millimeters. And Garrison insisted on using a regular Sherman crew, kids fresh from training. Nervous, never fired a shaped charge before. The gunner was a 21-year-old from Ohio named Michael. His hands shook loading the shell. He dropped it. Thomas's heart stopped, but the shell was fine. Michael picked it up, loaded it carefully, secured it. The gun roared. 0.85 seconds of flight. The shell struck the Tiger's front armor exactly where aimed. What happened next shocked everyone. The shaped charge detonated, copper jet formed in microseconds, 8,200 meters per second, 4,000 degrees Celsius. It punched through 100 millimeters of steel like cardboard. Inside the Tiger, the jet hit ammunition storage. Secondary explosion, massive. The Tiger's turret, 37 tons of steel, lifted into the air, flew 20 feet, crashed to earth with a sound like God's judgment. For 5 seconds, nobody spoke. Everyone stared at the destroyed Tiger. Turret separated from hull, smoke pouring from every opening. One shot, one kill. Morrison turned to Garrison. "Your assessment." Colonel Garrison's face was gray, his voice barely audible. "The test was successful. I recommend immediate production." Morrison nodded, looked at Thomas. "Dr. Mitchell, this nation owes you a debt. How fast can we manufacture these?" Thomas couldn't speak at first. Relief and exhaustion and vindication crashed through him like a wave. 50,000 per month by July, sir. You have every resource you need. Highest priority. Get it done. May through early June became a race against time. Thomas coordinated production across 3 plants: Pittsburgh, Gary, Indiana, Birmingham, Alabama. Factory workers, mostly women with their husbands overseas, learned to form copper cones with precision. Every cone measured, every shell tested. Quality control was obsessive. By May 31st, 8,000 shells manufactured. But shipping was a nightmare. German submarines hunted Allied convoys with unusual aggression. Intelligence suggested they'd heard rumors about new American super shells. Of 5 transport ships carrying Thomas's ammunition to England, 3 were torpedoed. 6,000 shells went to the Atlantic floor. That left 2,000 shells for 50,000 Sherman crews preparing to invade France. 4% would have the new ammunition. 96% would face Tigers with standard shells that couldn't penetrate. The lottery of life and death. Thomas wasn't at Normandy on June 6, 1904. He was in Pittsburgh. Margaret had gone into labor the day before. He sat in the hospital waiting room listening to radio reports. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of men, the largest amphibious invasion in history, and somewhere out there a few hundred tanks carried his shells. At 4:17 a.m. on June 7th, Thomas's son was born. Margaret looked exhausted but happy. "What should we name him?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "David. We're naming him David Mitchell, after his uncle." Margaret squeezed his hand. David would have liked that. The first battlefield reports arrived June 8th. Colonel Hayes called. "Tom, it's working. Units with your shells are reporting one-shot kills on Tigers. Sherman survival rates have jumped to over 60%. You did it. You saved them. But not all of them. Gold Beach, Sergeant Robert Hayes Warren's son, encountered a Tiger in hull-down position. Perfect defensive spot. Robert's crew loaded a heat shell. One shot. Tiger destroyed. Robert survived. Would fight through France and Belgium and Germany. Would come home to his father. Omaha Beach. Private Michael Chen didn't have the new shells. His Sherman named Bad Luck burned. He died. His crew died. Standard armor-piercing rounds had bounced off. Thomas would learn about Michael Chen later. Would carry that guilt. Some got the shells, some didn't. Some lived, some died. By June 10th, the statistics were undeniable. Units with shaped charge shells, 31% losses. Units without, 68% losses. The difference was life and death. Thomas held baby David in the hospital reading telegrams from the front. Margaret asked if he was happy. Thomas looked at his son, thought about his brother, about the men who'd lived, about the men who'd still died because there weren't enough shells. "I don't know," he said. "I saved some, not all." "Is that enough?" Margaret squeezed his hand. "It has to be. Many of you watching this video had fathers or grandfathers who fought in World War II, who climbed into tanks, who stormed beaches, who faced an enemy that seemed invincible. If your father served in the armored divisions, if he came home when the odds said he shouldn't have, if he lived to see his children and grandchildren grow up, there's a chance Thomas Mitchell saved his life. Not a guarantee, but a chance. Take a moment, leave a comment, share your family's story. These stories matter. They're why Thomas Mitchell refused to give up. They're why one stubborn engineer with borrowed equipment and scrap copper changed the course of history. In September 1944, Thomas was summoned to Washington. He expected recognition, maybe a medal, maybe a ceremony. What he got was a classified briefing. General Morrison looked uncomfortable. "Dr. Mitchell, your work is being classified top secret, indefinitely." Why? Because if the Soviets understand shaped charge physics, they'll develop countermeasures. We're not ready to share this technology, not even with our allies. The order was final. No publications, no discussing his work, no public recognition. The tank crews who survived because of his shells would never know who designed them. The families who got their sons back would never know who to thank. Thomas Mitchell would disappear into silence. He did receive Member of the British Empire Medal. The ceremony had 20 attendees. No press, no photographs. King George's representative shook his hand, said, "Well done." That was it. Colonel Garrison was quietly reassigned to supply logistics. Never promoted. Retired 1947 without fanfare. Thomas went back to the Bureau of Mines, back to studying rocks, like nothing had happened. David grew up, started school, asked his father what he did in the war. "I helped make things that kept soldiers safe," Thomas would say. That was all he could say. Sometimes letters arrived from tank crews who'd heard rumors, from Hayes updating him about Robert's life, from veterans who'd survived battles they shouldn't have. Thomas kept these letters in a locked drawer, couldn't respond in detail, but he kept them. Shaped charges became standard worldwide. Every military adopted them. Tow missiles, javelin missiles, bazookas, all used Thomas's principle, but his name appeared nowhere. 14 years later, February 1958, the government partially declassified World War II weapons programs. Small newspaper articles appeared. Pittsburgh engineers' designs saved thousands. Thomas was 49, graying, still working at the Bureau. Phone calls from reporters, letters from veterans, invitations to tank crew reunions. Thomas accepted a few, shook hands with middle-aged men who said, "I was at Normandy. We had your shells. I'm only alive because of you." Every time Thomas would tear up, not from pride, from relief, from knowing David's death had meant something. Thomas Mitchell died in 1972, age 63. Small funeral. Few headlines. Most people never knew his name. But today, right now, somewhere in the world, an American soldier is loading a javelin missile. That missile uses a shaped charge warhead. Copper cone at 42 degrees. Standoff distance 2.5 times the warhead diameter. The exact design Thomas Mitchell invented 80 years ago. In Ukraine, defenders destroy Russian tanks with weapons using Thomas's principle. NLAW missiles, Swedish-British design, shaped charge warheads. The stubborn Pennsylvania metallurgist who was laughed at by experts is still saving lives 8 decades later. This is what one person can do. One stubborn, determined American who refused to accept no, who challenged authority, who risked everything, who proved the experts wrong. Thomas Mitchell never wanted fame. He wanted David's death to mean something. He wanted boys to come home to their mothers. He wanted one fewer telegram saying regret to inform you. And he succeeded. Thousands came home who wouldn't have. That was enough. If you served, or your father served, or your grandfather served, if you were part of the greatest generation that defeated tyranny, take a moment in the comments to share your story. These stories are the real America. The America of stubborn individuals who refused to accept defeat, who challenged authority when authority was wrong, who believed one person could make a difference because, as Thomas Mitchell proved, one person can. Sometimes the most important Americans are the ones whose names we never learn. But their work, their stubborn, beautiful, life-saving work, lives forever. Hit subscribe if you believe that American spirit is worth preserving. That spirit of innovation, of challenging the system, of individuals changing the world against impossible odds. Share this story because in a time when people say one person can't make a difference, we need to remember Thomas Mitchell. We need to remember that experts can be wrong, that authority isn't always right, that the best solutions often come from the most unexpected places. And we need to remember David Mitchell, 23 years old, dead in the Tunisian desert, but not forgotten, never forgotten, because his brother made sure of that, made sure David's death saved thousands, made sure the sacrifice meant something, made sure that when the experts said impossible, someone answered, watch me. Thomas Mitchell, metallurgist, brother, father, the man who changed warfare forever, the man whose name you should know. Remember it, share it, honor it, because this is what America is supposed to be. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Civilians outsmarting generals. Determination defeating bureaucracy. One stubborn engineer with a crazy idea saving thousands of lives. That's the America worth fighting for. That's the America Thomas Mitchell believed in. And that's the America his copper cone shells helped preserve. God bless Thomas Mitchell. God bless the greatest generation, and God bless America.